Hello, hello. We are live. Delighted to be here. Let me get everything started. Awesome. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to another caring conversation. I am Dr. Keisha, and I am excited to have this conversation with you all. Last week was the first week of the Caring Conversations, and in the 7 days since then, I have been overwhelmed by a lot of the feedback. I see people are coming into the room. I'm delighted to see you here. Hey, N. Willis, welcome. Welcome, glad you're here. As others continue to join, I just want to spend a little bit of time saying thank you for all of the beautiful feedback, the caring notes that I have received. I was so nervous about how the first conversation would turn out that I realized I didn't really share anything about who I am and why am I the person that's sitting here talking to you about children's books. So let me amend that in this conversation. So my name is Dr. Keisha. I have an extensive background in early childhood literacy, starting in Beijing back in 2010, or actually Zhengzhou in 2010, and continuing up until now. I have advocated for literacy since then. So wow, if we start from, wow, that's a decade. Ooh. Great skincare. With that being said, I am here to answer your questions, really address any things that you may be thinking of as you think about how do I engage with my child. When I say child, I'm looking at early childhood to elementary. How do we have topics about difficult things? And so the theme last week was how do we talk about race with young children, and the theme this week is going to move forward to how do we teach children to stand up to racism. And this was inspired by the outstanding town hall Sesame Street held on last Saturday. I've shared the link in my IG, and I'll definitely share the link in the YouTube notes for this video. But if you haven't seen it, take a moment to look at it, because what makes this unique is that they include the voices of children, and you can actually hear, and they go from early childhood to elementary. You can actually begin to hear what children are thinking about this moment. And as I'm sure many of you know, children are profound. They say the darndest things, and sometimes they'll say things that may cause you to sort of not know what to say or not know how to even approach that. So that's why I created these conversations, so that we can have a space to engage in a dialogue, and I could also show you some outstanding materials to support your child's development of anti-racist theory, critical thinking skills. I'm really big on building 21st century skills as we talk about parent-child reading aloud, or as we talk about reading with children. I'm glad to see more people are coming in. You're welcome. As we get into this, I want to stop and give a couple of thank yous. Cameron Wicker, thank you so much for the beautiful note that you shared. I've posted it all over social media, so there's no need for me to go into great detail as to what you said. I just want to take a moment in this live and say thank you for sharing that. As a future teacher, you are inspired by what you're hearing here. That gives me motivation to continue to serve you all at the highest capacity that I can. And I don't think it's strange that you had some hesitation about how do we talk about racial issues or difficult topics. We are absolutely in an unprecedented moment, and we're learning together. And knowing that you feel comforted in that, knowing that you don't feel alone in how to approach these things, is why Dr. Keisha Cares was created. So Cameron, you are always welcome. Thank you so much for your beautiful note. If anyone wants to read Cameron's note, it's the post for June 11th. It's the headliner, so you can't miss her. I also want to give a additional thank you to Debbie Hatch. She is a grandmother, and Debbie shared her beautiful words. And this one you all haven't seen, so I'll actually share some of this one with you. Debbie Hatch says, I'm a grandma to 5 little people, and I've always considered their education to be a big part of my job. I'm a teacher by heart, a helper. That's how I choose to serve. My friend Keisha is doing amazing work around literacy and the absolute value of reading to children. She shares age-appropriate books in her Thursday live streams. Yay! And it's helping me to have positive discussions with my grandchildren about race. Discussions that are not centered around hate or fear, but that are from a place of love and inspiration. And Debbie, I could not have said it any better than you did. I think the main reason why we're here is to have difficult conversations from a place of love and inspiration. Because when we talk about things such as how do we stand up to racism with young children, particularly, we want to make sure that we do it in a way that is empowering and not from a place of fear or hatred, because then it makes the topic taboo. And you always want to create a pathway for conversation to continue. So being aware of how we introduce tough subjects, how we embed it in the books we choose to read is all the reason why I love what I do. So with that being said, let's jump into it. Now, I'm going to give you an overview of what you can expect today. Similar to last week, I'm going to share some outstanding books that I have personally curated around this topic, around how do we teach children to stand up to racism. But at any time in the dialogue, your questions are welcomed. So feel free to put them in the chat and I will respond accordingly. This is our time together, so no question is taboo. In the meantime, I'm going to continue to share resources, and I'm going to start off. I always like to center our conversations with a story or a book that really centers where we're going. And so I chose, let me first make sure that I can see your questions. I told you in the last video that I wear glasses, and since I'm not wearing them so you don't have a glare, it also means that I can't see your questions from where I'm at. So let me turn on that live, and then I will be able to join in. Awesome. Now, the book I want to share with you all is one of my absolute all-time favorites. It's called Sam. I always forget to cut the volume on. You think I would have remembered to mute, but I'm still learning. All right, so the book I'm sharing with you to center this conversation is called Sam and Dave Dig a Hole. And one of the reasons why I love this story, even though we have Sam and Dave, and if I could have made an editing note, I would have added a little bit of diversity, but that's okay. It's still a great story. Sam and Dave Dig a Hole. And one reason why I center our conversation with this book is as we talk about teaching children to stand up to racism, we need to be very clear in understanding that this is not a one-time thing. You don't stand up to racism once, or you don't find yourself standing up against something that's difficult and you never have to face it again. As adults, we know firsthand we have to develop a muscle of perseverance. And as we're teaching children how to stand up against difficult things, this is a great analogy because it says, it starts off by saying, Sam and Dave, I'll start at the beginning so you see how it builds up. On Monday, Sam and Dave dug a hole. And what I like about this story, I want to make sure you can really see this. Yes, there we go. When should we stop digging? Asked Sam. "We are on a mission," said Dave. "We won't stop digging until we find something spectacular." Now, that context really starts to set up this story, because as we dig into this issue of how do we stand up against racism, which is built on the foundation of what is race, what is racism, we also need to set up the understanding that this is something that's going to take a little bit of work, and don't stop digging until you see something spectacular. It could be in the issue, like if we look at the current context, these protests, people standing up, this IG live, all of these things started, and it's my illustration or my analogy of digging. You can see Sam and Dave starting to dig the surface level, and they decided, they had went a little bit of distance and then decided, we're going to go further. And as the story continues, you see the progress they continue to make. And this is where the story is just outstanding. Notice these diamonds, right? So as you're talking to children about this concept of standing up to racism, I always wonder, how do you put in mind a goal that is invisible? And this metaphor of the diamonds, standing for the end goal, what we want to see, the end of maybe some of the policies. What we're talking about right now is we're thinking about defunding the police, or we're starting to rethink how can we make our society more equitable. This is why we continue to dig, okay? You see that beauty? And so this represents effort. So as we talk about how do we dismantle racism, how do we have those difficult conversations, digging can be the illustration that you can connect that to with the child. Now here is the profound part. Notice that when they get close to a diamond, it is always around the time that, they've been digging for a while. So now, they're getting tired. And the language says they took a break. Dave drank chocolate milk out of a canteen. Sam ate animal cookies he had wrapped in their grandfather's handkerchief. "Maybe," said Dave, "the problem is that we are digging straight down." "Yes," said Sam, "that could be the problem. I think we should dig in another direction," said Dave. "Yes," said Sam, "that's a good idea." Now, what has happened up until this point is that they've been digging. They haven't seen any results. Message. And I'm going to put it in direct context. Think about the social justice movement of Black Lives Matter. That is something that has been generating, I think about, they're coming up on a significant amount of time. I believe they started in 2012 or 2015, but it's fair to say they've been digging for a few years. And there have been other cases and police weren't convicted. There's a lot of things that, they kept digging and they didn't see anything spectacular. They didn't see the diamond. They didn't hit, that moment of, all right. And they could have easily decided, we're going to stop digging and do something different. But by deciding to continue in that direction, you can teach the child that every time you think you're close to giving up, persevere, because you never know. You might be on the brink of greatness, or you might be on the brink of change. But it's also great context as we talk about difficult things such as racism, systemic racism, or inequality. These deeply held values. That's another great metaphor for digging. That it's not going to be an easy thing. And sometimes when you're tempted to give up, that's when you may be the closest. And so you see them going in a different direction. And that's not always a bad thing, because sometimes it leads to an even bigger discovery. But you, again, have to stay consistent. And so I never try to tell you the whole story, because I always want to incentivize you to get the book. But this story just continues to show why it's important that when we dig a hole or when we decide to take on something difficult, that we never allow ourselves to quit, or we always remember that just when we think we want to quit, we should go a little bit further because we may be right on the brink of something spectacular. So this was Sam and Dave Dig a Hole. I want you to know that all of the books that I share with you, I will always include in the YouTube description. So after the Caring Conversation, the IGTV copy is always made immediately available. In about 24 to 48 hours, you'll see the YouTube link shared, and that'll have every book that was shared and every research reference that was shared, and also a couple of goodies I think may help the conversation. So if you're not able to catch every book, don't worry, I got you covered. I care, right? I think I saw a question. Let's see. Oh, thank you. Hello, Georgia Peach, ATL. Wonderful to see you here. Thank you for your question. When it comes to our own implicit biases, should we tell our children? If so, any tips on how to do that? Ooh, yes, that's a great question. That's one that, I need to think through as I think about what books do I have to support this. When it comes to our own implicit biases, should we tell our children? First question to follow up, what's the age of the child? Okay? And in terms of implicit bias, there's so much room with that. Let's see. I always enjoy these questions because they give me an opportunity to think on so many different levels. Oh, I know what I can share with you. Great question. Okay, so your question really gave me an opportunity to think really deeply with you. So for those who are just in the room, the first great question from our community of care has come forward from Georgia Peach ATL, or GA Peach ATL, pardon me, Queen. And she asked a phenomenal question that gave me a growth mindset moment. I had to dig and think, okay, how can I answer that? And I'm going to share it with you again. She asked, when it comes to our own implicit biases, should we tell our children? If so, any tips on how to do that? Georgia Peach, if you're still in the room, I would love it if you could give out an age range. But until I have that, I'm just going to speak in general, okay? So when it comes to your implicit bias, that is something that's very human, and we sometimes subconsciously don't even realize we carry them. And if you're having this conversation with a very young child, then I would think about the language that I want to use, and I would possibly see if I could talk about my implicit bias through the character in the story, because since I'm not sure on what the implicit bias could be, for example, and this is my example, not yours. Say my implicit bias is that I prefer to spend time with people who look like me. Very common implicit bias. And I may have options to be more diverse with my friendship circle, but it's my bias, and I've probably done it for so long that I don't even realize I'm doing it. And note to adults, as you engage in this work, do not think it's strange if you start to have little light bulb moments as you're reading anti-racist, particularly if you're reading the books that I'm suggesting to you or that I'm curating, because they're always built to be intentionally critical, to inspire conversations that sort of invite you to delve deeper into yourself internally and as you dialogue with the child. Now, one author who has always done outstanding work in this area is a Japanese author by the name of Kathryn Otoshi. And I have all of her books. I know with the plastic on this, you're probably having a really difficult time seeing this. So let me open it up for you so you can see it without the glare. Now, her style of writing books is profound because she does two things. First of all, she has a series of books, 0, 1, 2. And each book uses the characters. The characters are colors or numbers or sometimes both. And since she approaches it from this lens, she really does a great job of immediately removing a lot of the barriers that you consistently find within a lot of children's books that focus on humans. But she talks about very human characteristics. So, Queen Peach, to answer your question about implicit bias, this outstanding question about implicit bias, I want to share that the number 2, this book, talks about how it starts off by saying 2 and 1 are close friends. It says, let me start here. 2 was a playful number. She was curved on the top, straight on the bottom, and friendly and warm like the sun. Her best friend was 1. Whenever they'd get a chance, they'd dance. She'd sing and snap. He'd tippity tap. What a pair they made. So the author starts off by setting up this friendship, right? But here's where implicit bias begins to show up in a way that you can use for your conversation, right? And the beautiful thing about storybooks is that you could take this moment. Now, the question was implicit bias, but you can insert a lot of different themes around that if implicit bias wasn't the particular thing you wanted to be critical about in your discussion. And it says, until 3 jumped in between them. You two are like glue, said 3, poking fun. Shake things up. Come play with me, 1. Odds are better than the rest, but 1 and 3 are the best. So what you see right here is your opportunity to insert implicit bias, because 1 and 3 are odd numbers. How awesome, right? Like, okay, I gotta geek out with you for a second, because she literally just worked in teaching children even and odd numbers as she told a story. Brilliant. So since 2 is an even number, the bias is, or the implicit bias is, you need to be 1 or 3 like us. And I can take your question even further, because as we talk about racism and the things we're seeing right now, this analogy of odds versus evens is another way of teaching children how it's very easy to divide. Math pun. It's very easy to divide the numbers or separate from our friends based on things we can't control. 2 had no control over what color she is, nor can she control what number she is. And it's the same thing with 1 and 3. But you have to make a conscious decision to either unlearn negative behaviors or widen your thinking. And as the story goes on, it talks about that division. So then you see, as 2 is kicked out of, the friendship pair because she's not an odd number, she finds solace in other even numbers, 2 and 4. And 0 sort of serves as the intermediator, the negotiator. Let it go, said 0. Just ignore them, added 4. 2 was blue. What did I do? 1 left without a word. Now, as we talk about critical thinking, because one thing I love to do with these caring conversations is invite you to think deeper about what you're seeing. So I want to point one thing out. As 3 jumps in and says, 2, you can't hang out with us because you're not an odd number. Since this conversation is about teaching children to stand up against racism or teaching children to really advocate, there was a missed opportunity here for 1. Because if you remember in the beginning of the story, 2 and 1 were great friends. And they spent all this time together. They had a really strong bond. And the moment 3 jumps in, notice that 1, all of a sudden, misses a great opportunity to stand up and defend number 2, or stand up and say, hey, 3, you're welcome to join us. You're welcome to play with us. but I don't believe in separating myself. 2 is my friend, and you can be my friend, but we play together. So if you see that, that's something in the very beginning of the story. And as we talk about the critical thinking skills, the beauty of having one be a character that doesn't say anything, as the parent particularly, or the adult that wants to teach children how to positively advocate for themselves or stand up against racism, this story gives you all these great opportunities. Now, what does that look like in terms of a question to the child? That's really mean that 3 kicked 2 out of the group. How do you think 2 felt? How do you think 1 felt? Explore what the child is thinking. And then say, what can we do in these type of situations? You want to turn it into a conversation. Now, research tells us when we're talking about heavy things like racism and inequality with particularly young children, we want to take it from an approach of, first, how do we break this down into something that they can comprehend? If you're talking about a very young child, early childhood, say 2, 3, 4, 5, they understand playtime, and they certainly understand what it's like not to be included in certain games. So that's something they'll have a visceral understanding of, because inevitably they probably experienced it in some context. So bringing it in here in that way opens up this beautiful opportunity to take something they understand and connect it to a larger description of racism, right? Because you can show how, well, that's sort of what we're dealing with right now as we think about what it means to have Black Lives Matter movements. There is a understanding that just as number 2 is yellow, well, if number 2 was black, there is a situation where a lot of black people are consistently noticing that they're being left out or they're being harmed. So you see how we're still talking about the issue, but we're using language that begins to connect the issue to a larger issue. And I want to tell you how this story, and I'll leave this question here because more people are always welcome to ask questions. It was just such a great question on implicit bias, I couldn't help myself. I want to share that as the story continues, you start to see this sharp divide between the odd numbers and the even numbers, and they continue to separate themselves. And you can connect that to a lot of other things too. I'll leave that open for you. But as you think about things that divide, but look at what it does to 2. It shows how it begins to eat away at 2's character because she is a friend of 1. And as this whole story about odds are better than evens continues to build momentum, it continues to take away from 2's character, and it also continues to eat away at the fact that she's friends with 1. So it talks about the conflict and the turmoil of what these negative things can do. And you can relate that back to how racism, when treated with such, disregard, how it actually eats away at the person. It stops them from having great friendships, like we talked about last week with the book All Are Welcome. And it also stops them from meeting new people and having better perspectives or better experiences as we walk through this amazing thing called life. And I want to share what 0 says, because this is another great moment in teaching children to stand up for themselves. Let me start here. Half of me doesn't care about the odd pair. Maybe it's time for me to be done with 1. Now remember, 1 and 2 are friends, and 2 is like, you know what, maybe this isn't even worth it. Let me ignore the problem. As adults, we do that all the time. Let me ignore the issue. Let me just cut this person off. But here comes 0. That's the smaller side of you talking, said 0. You're greater than that. The evens and odds are in a fight. What if you can make things right? Can you find it in your heart to see a new angle to this possibly? Now, gotta read this page, then I promise I'm gonna stop. Two thoughts and thought, and then, "You're right," she exclaimed, flipping herself around. "It is in me. I can be less than I've been or greater than I am. The choice is mine." And this is why this is such a great book to answer your question about how do we begin to approach implicit bias? How do we begin to address these things and talk about these things with young children? This moment really begins to talk about how I can be less than I am, which is I can acknowledge that I have implicit biases and continue on anyway and still say, hey, I only want to hang out with the even numbers, or I only want to hang out with the insert your own bias, right? Or I can be greater than I am. And if you are an adult talking with a child who may be, let's say 5, 6, 7, 8, old enough to really think about this with you, you can share the moments where you might have been less than you are, but then I want you to walk that child over to how you have challenged yourself to become greater now that you're aware of that bias. And so thank you so much for asking me this outstanding question, because it ties in beautifully into the work of how do we teach children to stand up to racism. And I think one of the first things we can do is acknowledge the own implicit biases that we carry. And Kathryn Otoshi's book, all of them are outstanding. 1, 0, and 2 are outstanding ways to begin to think about that message. I'm going to check and see if there are any questions. Feel free to throw them in. If not, I'm going to keep going. Let's see. Oh, I got an emoji from Miss G.A. Peach, so that must let me know that you like the answer. And I see a couple of great other emojis, so we're heading in the right direction. Wonderful. Guys, if you have questions, please let me know. Danny, welcome. William, welcome. Irie Love, welcome to the room. I see people are coming in. CBS, welcome back. Aishita, I hope I said your name right, Queen. Ashita, welcome. All right, I am going to jump into another great book. As I share this with you, feel free to keep the questions coming, because this is a caring conversation and you are the main focus. We're talking about how to teach children to stand up to racism. And I want to share an outstanding book called Say Something by Peter Reynolds. Now, as we begin to go deeper into how do we stand up to racism, one of the most important things I want you to understand as you talk about this with young children is that there is more than one way to approach a problem. I know the dominant narrative is, going outside and protesting, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there's more than one way to protest. There's more than one way to say something. And there's more than one way to be impactful. And that's why I love this story. Because as we continue to teach children how to use their voice, we can also honor and begin to recognize that there are so many beautiful ways and different variations to use your voice. Analogy or similarity. Think about singing. When I said that, I thought about people who maybe can't sing, but they can still sing, right? There's all these different variations. Some people have great voices. Some people have, maybe you should just hum voices. But wherever you are in the spectrum, those differences, when you bring them all together, you still have a beautiful sound, or you still have the ability to impact an atmosphere. It's the same way with saying something. And so this story begins to talk about using your voice in different ways. I'm going to share this with you. And as the questions come, feel free to throw more out there and we can go further with the dialogue. The world needs your voice. Mine? Yes, yours. And so first it starts off by acknowledging that everyone has a voice. So when you're with your child and you're talking about standing up to racism or standing up to difficult things, acknowledging that they all have the ability to do it. It doesn't matter how big or how small, is a great way to get started. Go ahead. It doesn't need to be perfect as long as it's from your heart. And then as the story continues, it begins to list out all these different ways you can say something. If you see someone lonely, say something by just being there for them. So it shows that saying something doesn't always mean talk. Sometimes it's the action. And if you were here last week, I shared the book, The Rabbit Listened, which really illustrated this point specifically in a story. If you see an empty canvas, say something with a brush. There you have it. Your artwork can speak for you. Your artwork can be your form of protest if we're talking about in this context. Now, since we talk about racism, I want to tie in another great point. So, Crayola, they have come out with a multicultural line of crayons. And the beauty of this concept is that every crayon in the box represents a different skin tone of the, somewhere a skin tone you can find somewhere in the world. So you have all these rich tans and beautiful browns and different shades of black or chocolate, however you want to call it. I'm a dark chocolate, so I have my biases. But in doing that, you have an opportunity to, talk about, since we're talking about art and we're talking about racism, there's an opportunity there to use those crayons. And if you get them from, you can find them in major retailers online, pack of 32 or pack of 8, very affordable. But if you're talking about art, you can use all of the crayons in the box to show how you can stand up against a one color story. And we talked about the power of the danger of the single story. So as we talk about that, there's different ways to expand that. And it says, if you see an empty lot, say something by planting a seed and watching it bloom. If you see someone being hurt, do I need to say it? Do I need to say it? Because you see it like I see it. Do you see the parallels between this moment and this story? If you see someone being hurt, say something by being brave. Hey, stop. Now, this page in particular, when children go back to whatever classroom is going to look like, or whenever they're back in large interactions with each other, inevitably you will see some form of someone being hurt. It could be someone being mean, like what we saw in the book 2, where people are being intentionally left out. You can't play with us. Or it could be in the common things of children wanting to play with certain toys and somebody's being a bully in the moment. Or if we have older children, we may actually have bullying where physical harm is being done. And maybe even in our younger children, depending on what they've been exposed to, you may have an aggressive child that is bullying other children. And so teaching the child, first off, by giving them the skills to know that this may happen, that's the first great step in the right direction. So when they find themselves in a situation where this is occurring, they won't be left with no idea of what to do. They will remember what you shared with them. And they will remember that here's an opportunity for me to be brave. So yay for you. If you see something beautiful, say something with a poem. Now, this expands the conversation, because up until now, everything we've been talking about in terms of using your voice or saying something or standing up against racism, we're looking at something that's negative and we're pushing back against it with something positive. But this also invites us to think in the opposite direction. Sometimes we can say something when we see something beautiful. For example, in this context of sticking with the theme of standing up to racism, I personally find it beautiful that when we look at the peaceful protests that are happening right now, you see great diversity. You see people young and old, all across the spectrum, coming together to protest against things that are wrong. You see police officers, police chiefs getting on TV and saying, you know what, we can do some things better. We are looking at this. We're making these changes. That is beauty in the midst of pain. That is beauty in the midst of difficulty. And that's a very important thing to share with children. So we don't look at anything from the light of a one-sided angle. There is always good in the midst of pain. There is always something beautiful in the midst of very trying times. And so reminding them to say something when they see something great, as well as when they see someone being hurt. They are all sides of the same coin, okay? So I paused. I think I'm back. So teaching a child to understand that you can use your voice in good and bad times will always be a beautiful skill for them to have, not only in younger childhood, but as they grow into adulthood. And what better time than to instill that concept into a child than in those early developmental years, okay? Now, again, if you have questions, let me know. Feel free to say something because I'm in my zone and I will keep talking. But I am keeping an eye on your comments. I think you guys just really enjoy the conversation. Okay, if you like the conversation, I'll keep going. Until I see a question, then I'll just keep teaching and sharing because I love doing this. Oh, let's not forget about STEM and STEAM. Let's get into science and the arts. If you have a brilliant idea, say something with confidence. And we see the beautiful moment. Eureka! Now, this is where the whole idea of standing up for yourself, standing up against racism, I love to bring in the context of you can stand up against racism by being brilliant. You can push back against negative ideals of, oh, you're just, well, if we're talking about racism, then you can talk about her however she identifies culturally or nationally. But we can also talk about gender. You know, she's a girl, or I assume I identify her as a girl. And maybe girls aren't supposed to be good at science. Or maybe she's a minority and you're not supposed to be here. Or whatever the negative voice says. You can say something by being brilliant in the face of that negativity. So teaching a child that you can say something by allowing yourself to think at your highest level, not allowing someone's negative. My father used to always say this to me: never allow someone's opinion of you to become your reality. And so you can challenge the child to say something by being brilliant, unapologetically brilliant. And if you know anything about me, I'm a big fan of unapologetic brilliance. And if you want to work on how we can instill that in children, schedule a consultation with me and I'll give you my full attention. I'll help you curate the most brilliant child we can manifest. Okay, now here's another one, because like I said, this is an outstanding book. Hey, Miss Fente. Hey, Fake Frog. Welcome. I'm glad you're laughing. Miss Fente gave me a yes. You came in at a great time. And if you guys have questions, feel free to throw them at me. This is a wonderful dialogue. If you want to show the world who you are, say something with style. Now, notice Miss Lady has decided to get super fly. And so she's put on her own unique outfit. I want to take this moment to embrace children who may be saying something about how they identify their gender, or this could be children who decide, I want to be gender fluid, or I don't want to have a definition of what I can wear, what I can't wear. And I want the freedom to let the world know who I am through the way I choose to dress. This is a great time to talk about that with the child or with your child, saying that you are always free to express yourself in any way you choose to dress. It could be like you see she has on, let me see if I can get closer. She has on these fluffy boots, striped pants, a bright green t-shirt or orange jacket, a little button that says, I can't read that because I don't have my glasses on, but it looks like an inspirational message. The sacrifices I'm making so you don't have glare. And my favorite, Sister Girl has on a big blue hat with a flower on it. As someone who's always rocking head wraps, I appreciate her style. But let's play with the narrative, okay? Let's assume, because we don't know. I'm assuming, I'm identifying her as a girl. What if it's a boy? What if this is a child that's identified as a boy but doesn't see themselves as a boy? You know, we might have a moment where we can embrace that as well. Because when we say something, sometimes we're not always saying something to the other person. Sometimes we're saying something to ourselves, such as, it is okay for me to decide that I want to wear a dress today, even if the gender norms say I shouldn't be in a dress because I'm a boy, or I shouldn't be or I should wear a dress because I'm a girl and I don't want to dress that way. This coin goes on both sides. So I also want to invite us to think about, as we talk about implicit bias, as we talk about standing up to unfair ideals or standing up to unfair projections of who we are, we should also be open to allowing our children to be creative with how they want to present themselves to the world. And we may not have to go as deep as gender norms. You just may have a child that decides, I want to wear a superhero costume, boy or girl. They may not have a problem with any labels, but they may be very eclectic in how they present themselves to the world. Let them know that however you want to tell the world who you are in a family that loves and supports you. And I recognize your voice, however you choose to use it. All right, I think you like where we're going. I haven't seen any questions yet or any more questions, but feel free to throw them at me. I'll just keep going. If you like what you're hearing, let me see some emojis, guys. Let me make sure you're still here. Throw some emojis at me and let me know that you are still with me and that you just like the way I tell stories or how I go through the books. Thank you, Miss Finte. Keep going? Okay, I'll keep going. If you are angry, say something to help people understand. Here's a primary emotion that children deal with, anger. And showing them how to use their anger in effective ways is a great context, particularly if we're talking about standing up to racism or standing up to inequality issues. At no point do we say that your anger isn't justified or that it's a problem to be angry. Anger is an effective emotion because it lets you know that something has occurred that has offended you, and it invites you to think about how you want to stand up for yourself. Now, some people may stand up for themselves in violent ways. They take that anger and they feel justified to hurt someone, like what we saw here. But we want to invite children to think deeper than that. You can take your anger and acknowledge that something has happened that offended you. And what you see here is the child who's angry confronts the child who caused the offense in their mind and says, "You made me feel invisible. That really hurt." And instead of saying something mean, the child was reflective, and they went inside and acknowledged what it was they were feeling, and then said how they felt in a way that was honest. They didn't cast blame. They simply explained what offended them and how it made them feel. And once the other child is made aware, they say, "I'm really sorry." And this scene allows you to model with the child, how can we handle offenses? Because they do come. As adults, we know this firsthand. But how can we teach children how to handle disputes? We acknowledge what they feel, and then we invite them to identify how it makes them feel to others, and let them know what it was that occurred that made them feel that way. "You made me feel invisible. That really hurt." And if I was the adult, or if I was the person writing this, I would have added another little bubble that simply said, "Can you tell me what I did?" Or "How did that happen?" Or "Help me understand what I did." I would probably add language that says, "When you played without me, you made me feel invisible." So the person has an opportunity to understand what was the offense. Because if I just know your feelings and I'm a child, I'm like, "Well, I'm sorry, but I may do it again because I don't know what made you feel invisible." Okay? So have fun with these stories. And it's also so important to know that what's on the page doesn't have to be all that's on the page. You can always add to it. And as someone who has, I have a PhD and a master's, every degree on thermostat, I'm telling you from a research perspective as well, that when people write stories, they're actually writing invitations to you as the storyteller to delve deeper into the relationship that you have with the child in front of you, and bring up things that you may have noticed in the day and use the story as a way to talk about it. So what are you saying, Dr. Keisha? What is this magic that you speak of, these invisible bubbles on the page? Well, I'm saying that if there was a time at this point in the day where, maybe your child has a sibling, maybe they're an only child, maybe they're upset because they're tired of sitting in the house, or they're tired of not being able to do the things that they want to do, or they're just irritable because, kids are kids. You just have days where they don't want to be bothered. Giving them opportunities to reflect on what that looked like in the course of the story. So you read this, and then you share, there was a time today where I felt really angry. This isn't about the child. We're not forcing them to talk about it. We start off with ourselves. There was a time today where I felt really angry. I live alone, but if I didn't, I could say, I really wanted to go to my favorite restaurant and have some pizza and a dessert, but I couldn't because I'm trying to practice social distancing and I'm trying to be safe. But when I look outside, I see other people just going to restaurants and not taking the same precautions. And sometimes that makes me angry because it feels unfair that I'm wearing a face mask and doing everything I can to flatten the curve and they don't. That's pretty heavy. Maybe a child doesn't understand my rant about flattening the curve, but just stick with me. And then invite the child to say, "Did you have any moments today where maybe you felt angry?" Make the facial expression. Your child better than I ever could. So whatever that looks like, invite them to tell you. You're not necessarily saying, "When do you feel angry? Can you tell me about it?" No, it's a conversation. It's a loving conversation, right? So you want to create opportunities where they can naturally share or not. Give them that power to choose. And because this is something you're doing daily, 15 minutes at least every day, every day, 15 minutes, you create these consistent opportunities for dialogue. I see a question. Okay, let me stop and answer this question. I'm happy to hear you are listening and learning, Miss Fente. You are always welcome to do so. What to do when your child doesn't express himself with words and acts out when he feels offended? That question gives me an opportunity to do two things. Okay, first off, there's a couple of things to address. Oh, it's 8. Wow, time flies. It's 8:56 and we stop at 9. So, Ms. Fente, I did not forget about you. I'm going to answer this question expeditiously. Shout out to T.I. Let me first give you a couple of options on how we can address a child who may not like to express themselves with words, but they maybe lash out. So, first, if you have a child that is consistently, lashing out with actions, let's give this child an opportunity to be loud. Sometimes people shout or yell when they're angry. I love to use this book. It's called Shout It Out. And the story is exactly what it implies. This is a book to read outside. This is not a bedtime story book. This is, I have a child, maybe my child has just had a little moment of anger, or I can sense that my child is angry. This is the book to get that anger out in a constructive way. And it says, everybody loves to shout. So if you know it, shout it out. Now, this is where I'm going to get silly, but this is how I am. So take them outside and read this book aloud and tell them, I need you to shout. Take all the emotion you feel and shout out these numbers. And you model that. So you're shouting, right? And so inevitably, as you're going through the story, they're shouting out their numbers, they're shouting out their ABCs. And so we've had a chance to you can ask them, are you all shouted out? How are you feeling? And you know your child, so you could tell when they may be laughing or another emotion has come forward, so anger isn't the dominant thing. Then there's a couple of directions you can go in. You can read another Kathryn Otoshi book that talks about bullying, or talks about when you have someone who's red hot. The color red really talks about anger. And you can use the illustrations to talk about how when you allow yourself to just grow hotter and hotter, that anger, you allow it to build because you're not really talking or you're not expressing yourself, you can show that you become really difficult in the sense of you have all this anger and people don't know, what it is that you're angry about. And so when you threaten to lash out against people, you actually begin to isolate yourself from other people, because a lot of people, other numbers came and stood up to 6. And so I hate that I'm having to rush because I have 1:17 left. But this is such a great question. But the story, and I may actually pick up and talk about this next Thursday so I can give it a more thorough job. But you want to show through the story that there are other ways to really begin to address the anger he's feeling. And also, if you have a child that doesn't like to use his words, and maybe books may seem a bit intimidating because he may not like to read or he may not like to speak, I want to recommend these beautiful jewels. They're called story cubes. And with the last 34 seconds that I have left, I want to share with you that Story cubes are these outstanding tools where they're just like little Yahtzee cubes, are like dice. And you shake them up and you throw them out, and each side has an image on it. And you can invite the child to tell a story using these cubes. So we can continue the theme, but they're not